Hello friends, welcome back. Tonight we are going to examine whether or not science as it is practiced today is a belief system, a faith, or is it a body of pure and pristine knowledge? Please mark my words, I'm talking about the way science is practiced, not science as a method. Friends, I know that we will all raise the chorus that science is not a faith or a belief system. But before we get there, let us admit a few facts. When we talk about a belief system, we mean faith, trust, or an acceptance of something that exists or is true. It is an acceptance, it is not a proof of something being true. As a matter of fact, it is a mental attitude of acceptance or assent towards a particular proposition without full intellectual knowledge to guarantee its truth. It is very comforting in stress. It alleviates anxiety, gives meaning to life, provides a sense of belonging, and it can even help you to cope with distress caused by feeling the lack of control. We all like to be in control, and the moment we lose that, we lose confidence in ourselves and the situation is very scary. So belief does all this and more. Belief, of course, is not the truth. It is what the word says. It is just a belief. Now, before we get into something serious, here are some beautiful quotes about beliefs. Believing is such a comfort that it is hard to give up just because it isn't true. Or here is another one which I like. An old belief is like an old shoe. We so value its comfort that we fail to notice the hole in it. Today we are going to see where the holes are. The holes on the upper side of a shoe are easy to find. And of course they can be quite embarrassing. But holes on the sole hurt. They may not be embarrassing, but they are very hurtful. And here is yet another quote. Democracy is a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. Simply put, it means a bunch of idiots don't make a genius. Now for some serious stuff. This is how Encyclopedia Britannica defines belief. The Encyclopedia Britannica says that belief is a mental attitude of acceptance of a proposition without full intellectual knowledge required to guarantee its truth. There's a whole bunch of words, but basically it tells us is belief is not the truth. But then, does belief have a place in science? And that we shall just find out in the next few minutes. So what exactly are mental attitudes? And are they of any use? Doubts are mental attitude. You can't start science without having a doubt about the way things are explained. So our hopes, our fears, our desires, and our intentions, they are all mental attitudes. We will now take a look at the very fountainhead of knowledge, the works of Sir Isaac Newton. Have you ever seen a copy of the Principia Mathematica, the famous tome? No, Newton does not mention calculus in the book at all. But we do have the laws of motion, a lot of geometry, and a lot of other laws of physics. I'll now zoom into the page which shows the laws of motion. And Newton describes these laws of motions as axioms. And what exactly do we mean by an axiom? Let us look at that a little more closely. The word axiom comes from a Greek root, axioma, which means something or a thought which is having value. Mathematicians assume that axioms are true without being able to prove them. They are taken as statements which everyone believes to be true. A statement of principle is generally accepted to be true, but it need not be so. So when we are talking about the laws of motion, essentially they are based on, or they have been defined as axioms by Newton himself. Here is how Newton and later day science uses axioms to construct theorems or laws, which create yet more laws. It could be using one axiom or a bundle of them to create certain laws. And in turn, these theorems and the axioms together can create yet more laws. But we must remember that the foundation of all these theorems or laws are in essence the axioms where it all started. Here is another page from the Principia. Newton, as we saw, worked on his theories from first principles using axioms, and at the end he demonstrated that the proposition which he is making could be proved at the end, and he appended the letters Q, E, D, which is shown here at the bottom. What QED actually means is that it signifies that the author's overall argument has just been proven. So the proposition over here is, if the figure BED is a parabola, I say, that means he is proposing. And he ends it with a QED where it signifies that his overall argument has just been proven. Now mind you, Newton does not use the word QED after the axioms or laws of motion. As a matter of fact, Newton was quite a religious man. He dabbled in astrology besides astronomy, and he also believed in the existence of a creator God. And therefore he thought that all these physical principles were in essence the laws of nature which were handed down to mankind through the creator himself. So now let us talk about beliefs that we are more familiar with. The religious beliefs. What they have actually is, they have an organization, they have certain scriptures or texts, they have symbols which have meaning, they make prophecies, and of course they have a code of ethics. This much we can agree without going into details or the finer distinctions between different religions. But we can agree on these few tenets or principles. Don't be surprised, but science too has all these ingredients of religion, faith, or whatever you wish to call. But that need not be a cause of embarrassment. Indeed, science is organized, it has scientific texts or publications, it uses symbology to express ideas, it makes prophecies based on theories, and it has a code of ethics and a code of conduct. This much we can all agree. But definitely science is much more than that. The beauty and strength of science is unbiased observation. Organized knowledge that builds on observation and theories of others. The best part is it gives a testable explanation which leads to predictions, not on the basis of a belief alone, but testable explanations. Let's see how science goes about it. We will all agree that the basic tenet of science is that you can do testable and repeatable experiments. Whether an 8-year-old does an experiment or an 80-year-old does the same experiment, given the same set of conditions, the results will be almost the same, if not exactly the same. This is the strength of science, isn't it? The sad part is that the very first basic tenet of science, that of replication or repeatability, is not fulfilled by medical science most of the times. Here is what Dr. John Ioannidis, who is a Stanford professor and who is widely cited, he has more than 360,000 citations to his papers. What he has to say is, false findings may be the majority or even the vast majority of published research claims. He goes on to say that it can be proven that most claimed research findings are false. Now that is a very big allegation. But this happens to be a fact. Ioannidis shocked and shamed the world of established medical science. They criticized him, but nobody could come forward and refute his claim. The irony is that non-replicable publications are cited more often than replicable ones. That means experiments which really don't have any worth or which cannot be repeated by other people to test their truthfulness or veracity are actually more popular in journals, and people cite them more often in further research. These are the findings which were published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a very respectable body of scientists, the oldest in America, in its 21st May 2021 issue of Science Advances. Now, why are non-replicable papers accepted for publications in the first place? And the answer to that is that the results of such research are more interesting. Something like yellow journalism, and the reviewers, who are themselves scientists of repute, apply lower standards regarding their reproducibility. Isn't that shocking? At least I find it so. We must ask ourselves, is John Ioannidis an exception to claim that most medical research that is published is not replicable? Let us see what people who run the top 3 medical journals in the world have to say. And these are the New England Journal of Medicine, the British Medical Journal, and the Lancet. They have been in publication for a long time. In fact, the New England Journal of Medicine is the oldest journal of medicine, being published continuously for over 200 years. Here is what Marcia Angell, the first woman editor-in-chief of New England Journal of Medicine, has to say. In many drug-intensive medical specialties, it is virtually impossible to find an expert who is not receiving payments from one or more drug companies. She emphasizes it in this particular book, Science on Trial, as well as in The Truth About Drug Companies. I shall not dwell on this long, but we shall see what the other 2 editors have to say about the top journals. Here is yet another quote from Marcia Angell. It is really very damning and shocking. She says it is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. I need not say anything further. Here is Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of the Lancet, and this is the reference from which I have drawn his quote. Richard Horton says that journals have devolved into information laundering operations for the pharmaceutical industry. Really very shocking and damning. In fact, John Ioannidis uses very mild language. But Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of the Lancet, goes so far as to say that these top medical journals are information laundering operations. I shall now quote the words of Richard Smith, the former editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, or the BMJ, for more than 25 years. He says, I must confess that it took me almost a quarter of a century editing for the BMJ to wake up to what was happening. Medical journals are an extension of the marketing arm of pharmaceutical companies. So dear friends, where is science? Can you expect replicability, especially when the stakes are so high? Now here is another shocker. Science cannot prove any theory. These are the words of Charles Bennett from Johns Hopkins University. He is a distinguished astrophysicist with more than 91,000 citations to his credit. And what he says is that I find myself frequently repeating to students and the public that science does not prove theories. Scientific measurements can only disprove theories or be consistent with them. There is no such thing as proving a scientific theory by experiment. An experiment can only confirm to state that the theory is consistent with the experiment. There is no such thing as a proof. This is something which even the most educated classes of people in science are not aware of. Let's see that at length in the next slide. Take a look at these headlines which are written by so-called science writers in science magazines and journals, which are read by scientifically minded people. They are all shouting from their rooftops that Eddington's famous experiment in 1918 during a total solar eclipse proved Einstein's theory of relativity. Mark the words proof, proved, proven. Dear friends, the 1918 eclipse experiment confirmed Einstein's theory of relativity. It did not prove it. We must choose our words wisely because words create beliefs. The beauty of science and the scientific method is the principle of falsifiability or refutability. It is the bedrock on which the edifice of science is built. For a theory to be considered scientific, it must be possible to be tested and conceivably proven false. Let us take an example in order to absorb this particular tenet. Perhaps you might be knowing that based on empirical evidence, it was for centuries hypothesized. Actually, it was considered to be an established fact or settled science that all swans are white. Until one day when a black swan was spotted. This single observation, this single exception to what was taken to be a law, falsified the hypothesis and unsettled the science that swans are white. Falling apples only confirm the law of gravity. But the day you find an apple flying up or moving horizontally instead of falling down, that day the law of gravity will be over and you'll have to start all over again. That is both the strength as well as the beauty of science. Sadly, this point is missed and people have started practicing science as if it were some kind of a belief system or a faith. At the outset, we must be clear about one thing, that correlation is not the same thing as causation. Now take a look at these two bar charts which are plotting two different observations. Here is how the Toronto's stock exchange Standard & Poor index behaved from 31st December 2007 to 31st December 2008. Now we look at another set of observations and compare the two. This is a record of the mean temperature in Calgary in degrees centigrade for the same dates, 31st December, minus 14 degrees Celsius, and 31st December 2008, which is minus 20 degrees Celsius. Surprisingly, the slope of the curve for both these observations is exactly the same. There is a very close correlation. Does it mean that the stock index of the Toronto Stock Exchange has a bearing on the mean daily temperature in Calgary, or vice versa? Certainly we are not so naive. Let us take another example. This is the AGW hypothesis, or the anthropogenic global warming. In simple words, the effect man is having on global warming. Indeed, we ought to be concerned about this and protect our planet. There is no argument about that. But what is the real science behind it? Is it rock solid like Newton's laws of motion? This is from NASA's web page. And it says, a consensus on climate change and its human cause exists. Now please mark the words used by NASA. It says consensus. We'll take a closer look at this particular word and its bearing on scientific thinking. On its web page, NASA goes on to say that multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that human activities are the primary cause of the observed climate warming trend over the past century. Please note the underlined phrase, peer-reviewed scientific journals. Friends, we have already seen how peer-reviewed scientific research journals work when it came to medical research. Medical research concerns every single citizen on the face of this earth, as does global warming. And do you think when the stakes are so high, there is not going to be any bias or influence from other extraneous sources? It is important to note that NASA does not make any claim of its own or knowledge based on its own research, but it quotes a number of other authorities and bodies. Out here I'll show you a sample. For example, here is what the American Meteorological Society has to say. It is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming. We'll come back in more detail to what the American Met Society had to say. Next, we'll take a look at what the American Geophysical Union has to say. It says that it is extremely likely that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of observed warming. Let's take a look at another example out of the many which have been quoted on the NASA website. Here is what the American Medical Association, a very respectable body, has to say. It says that it concurs with the scientific consensus that the Earth is undergoing adverse global climate change and that anthropogenic contributions are significant. Now, you will find some key words here. The American Met Society says extremely likely. Same applies to the statement of American Geophysical Union. And when it comes to the American Medical Association, it talks about a scientific consensus. So we'll now explore what exactly does consensus mean. Friends, we live in a society where we are using devices and we are using machines and so many other things for our convenience based on scientific principles. Let me ask you a simple question. Would you buy a ticket and board an aeroplane that is extremely likely or where the management of the company has a consensus that it will land safely? Certainly not. You want something that is rock solid science, not something by consensus or something that is likely. Let us see what is meant by the word consensus. Consensus is a political construct, not a scientific word. And who better to quote than a seasoned politician other than Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady of UK. And she dismisses consensus in these words: the process of abandoning all principles, values and policies in search of something in which no one believes, but to which no one objects, the process of avoiding the very issues that have to be solved, merely because you cannot get agreement on the way ahead. In other words, when something cannot be agreed upon, when something cannot be shown or demonstrated to be scientifically sound, then all of us or the people involved in that particular process kind of come to a mutual agreement of convenience, and that is what is a consensus. That is certainly not science. Let us not confuse ourselves with these words. Here is what scientists would say regarding consensus in science. Consensus has no value in a scientific argument. Only experimental evidence matters. Let us stay with that for a while. You might wonder whether my opinion or your opinion matters. Well, let's see what Galileo had to say regarding this matter. He said, "In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." So friends, please don't be swept off in that tsunami of information that is bombarded to you day in and day out on social media, in scientific journals. Don't leave your common sense. I'll take just one example out of many which I can quote. Regarding scientific consensus. No, we're not talking about any theory, but I'm talking about consensus. There was a scientific consensus for centuries on the cause of abdominal ulcers. And that consensus was ulcers are caused primarily by stress and spicy foods. But that was to change. It took the research and study of two researchers, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who found back in 1982 that the real cause of these ulcers was a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. For this particular discovery, they were awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in 2005. Isn't it remarkable? The work of two people upset the cart of consensus which had held sway for centuries. Naturally, one is likely to ask that a bacteria that was coexisting in human stomachs for hundreds of thousands of years must have had a purpose beyond just making people sick. Was there a possible symbiotic relationship? This has been debated ever since the discovery of that pathogen. However, the debate has been intensified in the past few years as some studies have posted the possibility that the infection may actually be beneficial in some human beings. Strong evidence suggests that the absence, now we are talking about the absence, not the presence of Helicobacter pylori, that the absence of this pathogen from the stomach may lead to cancers of other gut regions. So what is required is to have a holistic view, whether it comes to medicine, social sciences, or even the environment. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Big Bang theory of cosmology. We take that for granted. We teach our children, our grandchildren, or whomsoever cares to listen to us about the beauty and the simplicity of the Big Bang theory. Did you know that actually the Big Bang theory is what we can call as reconstructed history? It is not testable by repeatable experiments. It is based on inference and speculation. So actually it does not fall into the ambit of true science. Here is what the British Parliamentary Committee had to say about the long arms of the pharmaceutical industry. In its report, it said that profits registered by the 10 drug companies on the Fortune 500 list were equal to more than half the profits netted by the entire roster of Fortune 500. I think that speaks for itself. The multi-party committee reported unanimously, and it held that these companies have sweeping influence over controlling research, publications of the research findings selectively, steering public opinion and impacting government policy. And it also says that Britain is not unique in these circumstances. It applies across the board to companies and governments in other parts of the Western world. Let's take a look at the revenues of the top 5 pharmaceutical companies from one single product, vaccines. And we are looking at figures from the year 2019. That is before COVID-19 happened. These numbers are in billions of US dollars. GSK, more than $10 billion. Merck, Sanofi, Pfizer, and Novax. This is just regarding the top 5 companies, not a summary of all the companies put together. If you add up all this, it comes to 38 billion US dollars. Out of the 194 countries in the world, 150 countries have an individual GDP less than this number. That includes Western democracies like Belgium, Austria, Portugal, New Zealand, and even oil-rich countries like Oman. In the next graphic, we'll see how COVID-19 helped these companies. These are the financial results of the top 5 pharmaceutical companies for the first quarter of 2021. That means they are reaping the harvest of vaccines. Just compare them with the first quarter 1 year earlier, and you'll find that COVID-19 indeed has been a blessing for these companies and their shareholders. Pfizer, which is much in the news today, the profits jumped by a whopping 44%. In fact, AstraZeneca doubled its profits. The profits went up 100%. And mind you, we are looking at profits, not at revenue numbers or sales numbers. We will now take a quick look at the projected sales figures for the top 5 pharma companies for the year 2021. And if we add up all these numbers, that comes to more than 245 billion US dollars. More than or nearly $250 billion. To get an idea of what these big numbers mean, let us compare them to the much maligned arms industry. Everyone blames this particular industry as the cause of war and unrest. That's what President Eisenhower also said after he became the president. He said that the future of nations' public policy will be determined by the military-industrial complex. And in particular, he was talking about the armament industry. But if we take the top 8 arms manufacturers, their total sales for the year 2019 came to just $225 billion. Compare this with the figures of the 5 pharmaceutical companies which we saw in the previous slide. It falls short by more than 20 billion US dollars. That itself has a long story to tell. Exactly how does the pharmaceutical industry achieve all this? It does so by a term coined by the British Parliamentary Committee that we spoke about a little while ago. And that term is medicalization. Medicalization is about convincing healthy people that they are sick and that they require medicines. The Parliamentary Committee, in fact, called it a pill for every ill. Let us now discuss the tactics of disease mongering or medicalization. The first step is to take a normal function and imply that there is something wrong with it and that it requires to be treated. Try to define as large a proportion of the population as possible to be suffering from that so-called disease or condition. Once that is done, then use a wrong or a vague endpoint. And what exactly do we mean by an endpoint? It means that there is no clear defined outcome of the treatment that is being promoted through medicalization. Some more smart tricks or tactics used for medicalization or disease mongering are to take a common symptom and make it sound as if it is a sign of a very serious disease. so that you are not only doing disease mongering but also fear mongering. Next, another tactic is to promote technology as a risk-free magic. Impress people with technology as if something that was not possible in the past is now possible simply because of the advances of science. Yet another tactic is the selective use of statistics to exaggerate the benefits of the treatment. Nobody goes for the original publications. People just go by word of mouth publicity, which has been promoted by the manufacturers of that particular treatment or drug intervention. Here are some examples of medicalization or finding a pill for every ill. You must be familiar with most of them, at least by name. Erectile dysfunction, ADHD, bipolar disorder, osteoporosis, restless leg syndrome. So the references to these research papers outlining this is given at the bottom of the slide. One point we must note is that patients are to blame also. It is not only drug companies who are to blame, but also the physicians who diagnose a disorder and prescribe a drug, as well as the patients who feel that they have a serious disease that needs treatment. So it's a joint effort of the drug company, the physician, as well as the patient who is insisting on a treatment for a perceived threat or disease. We must keep that in mind. The reference to this particular finding is shown here on the slide on top. So friends, that brings me to the end of this video. Let me now summarize what we have covered so far. We talked about the concept of beliefs and axioms. Neither beliefs nor axioms are the truth. It is only through careful and unbiased observation and experiment, which can be repeated, can we be led to a better understanding of nature. Next, we saw that true scientific theories are falsifiable. In other words, they are testable, and these tests should be possible to be repeated anywhere in the world, anytime, given the same circumstances or conditions. Following that, we saw that there is a big crisis in replicability of scientific research that is published in top-class professional journals. Hardly a small percentage of these studies can be replicated, and this comes from some of the top authorities in the field. Next, we said that consensus is not science. Even on the NASA site, we saw this unscientific word being used in relation to a major global political issue. So let us remind ourselves, consensus is a political construct, not science. Then we saw the crisis that is being faced in peer review journals. Is peer review really unbiased? The people who are influencing what is published, what is researched, and how the opinion is swayed is controlled by the industries who are behind this research. We had taken up the example of medical research. Finally, we also saw the concept of medicalization, in which we saw that a normal human condition is converted to look as if it is a medical condition. So, what is the driving force behind this? It is naturally financial interests and money. And the money we saw are big bags of money, which in fact go beyond the total revenue of armament manufacturers who are much maligned in the media as well as in the common thinking of a person. So thank you friends for your attention and your encouragement. And until we meet in another video, till then, bye-bye.